The next day, at the Academy's training field, Lexus tightly gripped the wooden sword and with a determined look, began to advance quickly towards her opponent. Her opponent was Princess Erin. Lexus attacked her with all her strength, but she placed the sword in front and blocked the attack at the last second. Due to the difference in strength, she clenched her teeth tightly and couldn't help but wonder why she was so strong. Erin decided not to stand idly by and decided to keep up with Lexus. She told her that this was nothing and then counterattacked, swinging her sword. But to her surprise, in the blink of an eye, Lexus moved at an incredible speed, ducked, dodged the attack, and appeared behind her. Upon seeing this, the princess couldn't help but wonder what was happening, and just before she could make a move, Lexus placed the sword on her neck, addressed her as Your Highness, and told her that she was the winner of this duel. The princess slightly turned her head towards Lexus, and while sweat was dripping from her face, she began to look at Lexus with a surprised expression and accepted defeat. Erin, who was holding the sword with one hand, turned her head towards her and thought that she couldn't defeat Lexus. After saying this, she reminded her that she had told her to call her Erin when they were alone. Lexus, who was pointing the sword at the back of her neck with one hand, placed the other behind her head and with a confused look apologized to her and called her Highness again. Upon hearing this, Erin began to look at her with an aggressive gaze and told her again to call her Lady Erin instead of Your Highness. Lexus panicked and with a trembling voice called her Lady Erin. While the two of them were conversing, someone else who was also training in the training field started shouting. Upon hearing this, Lexus and Erin turned their heads to the side, and she told her that they were also training very intensely. The person who was shouting was none other than Brian. Someone punched him hard in the abdomen, causing him to spit saliva and scream in pain. Then they gave him a strong kick behind the knee, making him lose his balance. This person was Cyan. He adopted an offensive stance, and just before Brian could fall to the ground, he gave him a strong elbow in the abdomen, causing his body to shoot backwards. Due to the pain, Brian placed both hands on his abdomen, lowered his head and began to move backward. Cyan simply started looking down at the ground and remained silent. While he had an offensive stance, he turned his head towards Brian, and with a serious look, thought that he was quite resilient for someone who had claimed to be the handyman among his peers. He also came to the conclusion that Brian's resistance was impressive. Brian managed to stop his body in motion, and while holding his hands on his belly, he lifted his head, began to look at Cyan and pant heavily. Seeing this, Cyan had no doubt that in the future, Brian would be very useful. He asked Brian if he was tired. In response, Brian opened his mouth and while spitting blood, he replied to him with a no, adding that he was willing to endure until the end. Seeing that he was bleeding, Cyan became somewhat confused and surprised at the same time. Despite the training being difficult and exhausting, it couldn't be avoided. He began to stare at Brian with a serious look and thought that since there was no guarantee that something similar to Barrett's attack would not happen again, Brian needed to be able to protect himself at the very least. Brian approached him and with a surprised look asked him if it was okay to have someone like Kellen around. With a calm look, Cyan told him not to worry about that guy anymore as he was now on their side. The previous day, Cyan used the creation ability called Shadow Personality, causing a shadow to enter Kellen's body through his mouth and eyes, making him start writhing in pain. Brian had a bruise on his eye and cheek the previous day. Upon seeing what was happening, he couldn't help but be somewhat surprised and wonder what this ability was. He was sitting, his back supported against some wooden boxes, and he was holding his arm wound with his other hand. Beside him stood Cyan, who had his hand extended towards Kellen and was using the Shadow Personality ability. In a matter of seconds, the energy emanating from his hand began to enter Kellen's body, who had his hands tied and was lying on the ground. While the dark energy was emanating from Cyan's hand, he turned his head towards it, and his eyes began to close because he felt very tired since he hadn't used this ability in a long time. The 9-star grade darkness element magic ability called Shadow Personality was a spell that created a new personality from the shadows, allowing one to control the target as desired. Several seconds later, once the energy had fully entered Kelvin's body, Cyan approached him, pulled out a knife, and cut the rope. He had only used this ability once in his previous life. While holding the knife with one hand, he stood up and asked Kellen who he was to see if the ability had really worked. While Kellen's body was surrounded by Cyan's energy, he bowed before him, placed his elbow on his knee, began to look at the ground, and introduced himself as Kellen Diego, an official guard knight of Velias. He didn't even look into Cyan's eyes. He continued looking down and revealed to him that he had come to Lewin after receiving the task of keeping watch over young Master Cyan. Upon seeing that Kellen had become obedient, he couldn't help but feel joyful. He began to look at him and asked who his master was. Kellen, with one hand resting on his knee, continued looking down at the ground and explained that although originally he had served the young master Ashel, he would like to serve the young master Cyan now. He asked him kindly to accept him. With a smile, Cyan accepted and asked him to listen carefully to his words from this point on. He gave him the order to return to Ashel and Velias and tell him everything he was going to say. He began staring at Kellen intently and with a smile. He ordered him to tell all of this to Ashel without leaving out a single word. Kellen clenched his fist tightly, struck the ground, began to look down and swore by his name that he would do what Cyan had told him. He lifted his head, and while his eyes were shining, with a confident gaze he started staring into Cyan's eyes. Back in the present, Cyan turned his head to the side and with a confused look, thought that the trusting gaze in Kellen's eyes was a bit too overwhelming. He thought that this guy was definitely dangerous in some way. Seeing Cyan's expression, Brian started to wonder if he was okay. Cyan thought that for now Kellen would be fine. Erin approached them, put her hands on her hips, and asked him if he was here training with the guardian knight of his. She hadn't thought she would see him here. Leximus, who was standing next to her and holding the two wooden swords, simply remained silent. Cyan turned his head towards her, addressed her as Your Highness, responded with a yes and also asked her if she had come here to train as well. Upon seeing the princess, Brian began to bow his head before her to show respect. Erin began to approach them and with a smile, she explained that she came here every weekend to train in sword combat with Leximus. Since there was that incident recently, she thought she should prepare herself. Cyan looked away from her, started looking to the side, and wondered if she was really training because of the incident that had happened a week ago. A week ago, while it was raining, Barrett was found completely incapacitated in front of the healing facility. Despite his body being battered, he had not revealed the culprit behind his condition until the end. Barrett's eyes were filled with terror. Cyan knew that it was not just because he couldn't reveal it, but because he wouldn't. He also would never be able to use magic again. Cyan turned his head towards Leximus, and with a serious look, he thought that her reaction had been somewhat unexpected. Leximus began to look down at the ground with a lost gaze and remained silent in thought. Cyan had thought that she would be at least somewhat satisfied. At that moment, the dragon girl named Nana appeared calling Cyan Papa. She was falling from the sky. Brian looked up at the sky and upon seeing this, he couldn't help but feel somewhat confused and surprised at the same time. With a surprised look, Brian caught Cyan's attention and asked him to look up at the sky. Cyan complied, and upon doing so, his expression changed drastically. He couldn't help but be terrified and wonder what Nana was doing here. He remembered leaving her in charge of Karam. The reality was that Karam, instead of taking care of the girl, was sleeping like a log on the couch. Nana fell from the sky into Erin's arms. Quickly, she picked her up and started looking at her with a confused look, wondering where this girl had come from. Nana clenched her fists, began to look at Cyan with a tender gaze, and told him that she had found her daddy. Upon hearing that Cyan was Nana's daddy, Princess Erin started looking at him with a confused gaze and began to wonder what was happening. Nana began pointing her finger at Cyan and calling him daddy again. Upon hearing this, both Erin and Leximus were shocked. Cyan started sweating and wondering why Nana had come here. Erin was perplexed and began wondering who Cyan had a child with and when. Cyan began to look towards one side and many questions came to the mind of the princess and Leximus. That same day, it started to get dark. They went to the princess's room, and Cyan told them what had happened and where Nana had come from. Leximus started playing with her. Erin began wiping her forehead with her hand and felt quite relieved to see that Nana was not Cyan's daughter. She had misunderstood because she was calling him daddy. Seeing that he had such a kind side, she thought this was unexpected. He started sweating and thought this was bad, as the princess would discover his weakness at this rate. Brian also started to sweat. He became somewhat nervous and thought that Cyan would be expelled if the academy found out about this, and she even knew that Nana was a dragonborn. She put her hand on her chest, and with a confident look, she asked Cyan not to worry about this since she wasn't going to tell anyone about it. Upon hearing this, both Cyan and Brian were somewhat surprised. He addressed her as Your Highness and asked if she was serious. Leximus placed Nana on her lap, gently held her cheeks with his fingers, closed her eyes, and started playing with her with a pleasant smile. Erin sat next to them, and while placing her hand on her chest, she turned her head towards them and replied to Cyan that she was being serious. After saying this, she asked Leximus if she would also keep the secret. Leximus turned her head towards her, closed her eyes, and with a pleasant smile replied with a yes, adding that she didn't have anyone to tell this because she didn't have friends anyway. Upon hearing this, Eren was shocked and started feeling bad for her. Cyan, who was sitting next to them, began looking at her with a calm gaze, caught her attention and asked what the reason behind this was. She turned her head towards Cyan and with a pleasant look asked him what he meant by reason, adding that she simply felt bad for her. While Nana and Leximus were happily playing, she explained to him that Nana did not belong to either the human race or the dragons, so she would not be accepted by either of them. For her, it was a relief that he was taking care of her. Upon hearing this, Cyan couldn't help but think that she was a good person. She approached him, started pointing at him with her finger, and in exchange for keeping the secret, she asked if she could visit his room from time to time. Cyan was somewhat confused. He started pointing at himself with his finger, and with a puzzled look he asked her if she really wanted to visit his room. Quickly, she placed her hand on her shoulder, looked away from him, and asked him not to make a mistake since she only wanted to see Nana occasionally. He silently watched her for several seconds and agreed, thinking it didn't matter. She brought her fist close to her face, started looking to one side and couldn't help but blush. Cyan began pointing towards the ceiling with his finger and told her that this was going to be their secret from now on. In response, she started looking into his eyes and replied with a yes, adding that she would keep it in mind. When she realized that this was going to be their secret, she couldn't help but turn red as a tomato and feel happy at the same time. Brian picked up Nana in his arms, and Cyan, who had his hands in his pants pockets, said goodbye to them, explaining that they had to leave now. Eren simply remained silent, and Leximus bowed her head before him to thank him, and asked him to take care on his way. Cyan, Brian, and Nana left. Several seconds later, Leximus turned her head back and upon seeing the princess's expression, she became somewhat confused and asked her if she was okay. Eren was very red and happy at the same time, as she thought this meant that she had gotten a little closer to Cyan. Seeing that she was red, Leximus asked her if she felt sick anywhere. At the same time, Cyan and the others returned to the royal hall. Karam started staring at him and with a smile, asked them what kind of entertaining event had happened while she was sleeping. She also asked why at this point the academy hadn't caught him living with a demonic sword. Cyan became furious, started pointing at her with his finger, asked her to shut up, and ordered her to go reflect on her own mistakes since she had been the one who fell asleep while taking care of the child. Karam, who had both arms resting on the sofa, began to look to one side and told him that she resembled her father, being completely unpredictable. Brian, who was holding Nana in his arms, approached him and suggested the idea of taking Nana for a walk since she must be stressed from staying at home all the time. She began to reach out her hands towards him, indicating that she wanted to play. Cyan crossed his arms, turned his head towards Brian, and thought that this didn't sound like a bad idea. Brian started to feel happy, thanked him, and they decided to leave now. At the same time, two dragons began flying through the sky. One of them looked sideways and noticed the presence of something. Quickly, he stopped and with a serious look, began to gaze at the ground. Upon seeing this, she also stopped, turned her head towards him and couldn't help but wonder what was happening. She started approaching him, called him Lord Lucian, and asked him what the problem was. Lucian continued looking at the ground and explained to Kadelina that he smelled something bad. He asked her where they were now. She turned her head towards him and with a serious look, she explained that they were a little far away, but it seemed like they were on the outskirts of Lewin. With a serious look, he asked her if this smell came from the Lewin Academy. He decided to postpone his return for now. He began pointing towards the academy and with a murderous look explained to her that he felt an energy there that he couldn't even bear to look at, an energy that he couldn't tolerate being a dragon. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.